As I said just a moment ago, I'm going to talk you through the lesson today, as well as talk you through the artworks rather than making my remarks ahead of time. So I think we can dim the lights and start the music. Of course, we're going to begin with Jesus arrested. Now, the betrayer, Judas, had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. And as per usual, we start again in the Scrovegni Chapel, where really the Renaissance was launched by Giotto. And we take a look at this picture of Judas, so often featured in the yellow robe of cowardice, kissing Christ, and Peter cutting off Malchus's ear as somebody here is trying to hold another disciple, keeping him from running away. And the accusers and priests and so on are here in attendance. And then the Maesta, which we've seen a number of times, which was groundbreaking in Siena, this huge altarpiece, some 23 feet long. Zooming in, we see Jesus in the garden, praying that the cup might pass from him, and then the arrest, the kiss of Judas, Peter with his knife, and the rest of the disciples fleeing. This is just a masterful engraving by Schongauer. He was one of the, if not the greatest, of all engravers. And you can see Peter with his sword. This is Malchus down here, and Dürer will pick this up in the next print that you see. This is Judas escaping with the money bag. And you see the accusers all shouting. They have their mouths open. Jesus is resolutely silent and does not, he neither flinches nor does he try to push them away. He accepts what has to happen, the cup that he knows he must drink. So a gorgeous print. And Dürer picks it up. You can see this position of Malchus and Peter is a direct take from Schongauer, but the rest is very different. Jesus with, as usual, Dürer's very heavy drapery. He's known for that. And in the way distance here, there's John Mark fleeing, and he leaves his robe in his pursuer's hands and flees naked. We think it's John Mark, the writer of Mark's Gospel. A much heavier hand has Dürer, but equally masterful. He did a whole series of passion sequences, the little passion, the big passion, the green passion. And by the way, his prints, a number of them, are coming to the National Gallery in Washington. They are there as of yesterday, I think, and will be there for several months, and certainly worth the detour if you're in Washington. Bosch, a follower of Bosch, again, the very macabre scenes that Bosch loves to portray, and this follower is very much in that vein, with hideous faces, a man, probably Malchus, biting Peter, who has his sword held aloft, everybody looking sinister, except Jesus, whose eyes are downcast as he accepts what is about to happen. Caravaggio's wonderful use of chiaroscuro to great effect in this, the effect of light and dark. He's virtually excluded the background. It's highly dramatic, so you just have this scene right up front, very cinematic, and his use of oil paint makes possible what he does with the wonderful armor glistening. Notice that the men who are arresting Jesus can't even see him. It's a blindness that Caravaggio is alluding to, with Judas being the one who looks directly at Christ. John is about to lose his cloak as he flees. This, interestingly, is the artist himself. It's Caravaggio who has painted his own self-portrait into this, as if to say the artist can see this. This is his own meditation on this very sinister event. So he's the one who is allowed to see here. I bring you two pictures by Goya because they're very, very different. At this moment in Goya's career, Francisco Goya, he was painting for the nobility, the aristocracy, the royalty of Spain. And it's a remarkable picture in itself. It's very small, very poignant, but look what happens 10 years later. A very, very different take. It's about the same size. He reworked a number of his pictures, and this is after he suffered a disease. It might have been Meniere's disease. It had many of those symptoms. He lost his hearing. He had what sounded like fits in a way, and he descended into a deep depression for several years and painted really terrifying images. And it's just coming out of that period that he began reworking his pieces, and that's what you see here. A very, very different take, but very powerful. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He's worthy of death," they answered. So here we have Dürer's version of Caiaphas rending his garments in objection and sorrow and fury, and Jesus standing manacled, his hands tied, chain around his neck, his accusers shouting, and Caiaphas about to send him on to Pilate for further judgment. You will remember that the Jews as a nation could not put to death a prisoner. It had to be done by the Roman authorities. So it's up to Caiaphas and his minions to convince Pilate and the Roman government, essentially, that Jesus needed to be put to death as a threat to their ruler. This is Honthorst very much following in the footsteps of Caravaggio. He's one of the Caravaggisti who worked in the Netherlands, very much picking up Caravaggio's chiaroscuro technique. We see Caiaphas shaking his finger at Jesus, accusing him, questioning him, and a little more of a close-up, just a wonderful interchange. Not a word need be said to tell you exactly the emotion, the drama of this event, and the brilliant single candle lighting up a very, very dark scene. Jesus looking with sorrow, with pity, resignation. You can assign him the emotion that you feel he might have been experiencing. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. This is one of Tintoretto's best. I'm not a huge fan of Tintoretto, but the way he makes Jesus just so strong, just almost like this column in back of him. He is brilliantly lit. He's the brightest figure in this very vertical painting, and all the rest seems almost messy beside him. This is Pilate holding out his hands to have them washed, the water poured on them by a servant. Here's a scribe down here taking down Pilate's words of condemnation, or at least recording the interview, because Jesus is not condemned at this point. But a very, very strong picture. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is from another place." "So you are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. And really, this is the point of the entire story. It's how you answer that question, what is truth, that's going to make all the difference. If I've brought you as those shepherds we talked about earlier who might have been alive at the time of Jesus' birth and were alive 30 years later to see him go through his ministry, it's now up to you as that shepherd to decide if he is the Messiah, if he has spoken the truth, or if you reject him, as Pilate does, with a very cynical, "What is truth?" Very, very telling picture by a Russian artist, Nikolai Gay, spelled alternatively G-E or G-A-Y, French parents. Daguet was the family. Pilate certainly saying to Jesus, "What is truth?" It's such a powerful picture with that single shaft of light, very unusually Jesus in the darkness. And it's just, the question hangs in the air. Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod, that is Herod Antipas's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Pilate would have loved it had he been able to get Herod to make the uncomfortable decision. Herod just mocked Jesus and sent him back to Pilate, so that ploy didn't work. This is one of the oldest prints, if not the oldest, in the the National Gallery's collection in London. It's a woodcut done by hand because this is long before the invention of the printing press. So you can see the press doesn't even quite catch all the ink that creates Jesus' face. But we know this is Herod by his crown, and this is the scene. Only recorded, I believe, in Luke's gospel. And this should strike you as very familiar because it's the very posture we saw that Tintoretto used, and Tintoretto knew Dürer's work and surely was influenced by him. Had seen this wonderful work with Jesus absolutely columnar before King Herod, distinguished again by his crown. Then he released Barabbas to them. This is because the crowd clamored that Barabbas be freed rather than Jesus. But he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. This is one of Piero della Francesca's most famous works. I advise you to go online to read about it and study it because I can't completely open it up for you here. It's often used as the single best example of single point, vanishing point construction perspective that exists. Mathematicians have tackled this painting from every kind of direction, lauding its perfection. And there have been CAD drawings made, computer-assisted drawings, that can create this scene in 3D because the perspective is so absolutely perfect. Very unusually, Jesus is in the background being flogged, and you have this ornately dressed man who is probably representing Niccolo d'Este, who was the Duke of Ferrara. And this is a man dressed in Greek costume. This is probably John Palaeologus, who was the second to the last emperor of Byzantium, what we know as Constantinople. And it's thought that this scene represents a council that took place in Ferrara and in Florence in 1439, which was an attempt to bring the church in Constantinople, or Byzantium, together with the Catholic Church in Rome, because the two had split. The council failed, And as a result, we have Palaeologus, the Byzantine emperor, looking on as Jesus representing the entire church, or at least the Western church, is flogged beneath a Roman god. Piero was present at this council years before and lamented the fact that it didn't work because it meant essentially that Constantinople would fall to the Turks, which it did in 1453, was lost to Christendom for a great deal of time. This is supposedly the Turkish Sultan looking on as Jesus receives his flagellation. Entirely different take here, because whereas you had Jesus in recession in the background, seemingly a scene that was just going on in the background, Jesus is inescapable. You are faced with him right up front. It's a very small picture in the Louvre, but could not be more powerful in conveying Jesus' agony. Antonello was thought to be the very first person to introduce oil painting into Italy, and he has certainly mastered the technique. You could not have a tear like that without having mastered oils. That kind of transparency, that beautiful glistening water, is only possible with oils. Very, very poignant Christ looking to the Father as he suffers the lash. The use of chiaroscuro again by Caravaggio, these brutal men tying Jesus, preparing to whip him. There's a man down here whose face is hidden. He's preparing his own scourge. This man is pulling Jesus' hair, and this man is tying him into place on the column that almost disappears. Caravaggio drew his inspiration from this picture by Sebastiano del Piombo, who was, as you know, the great student of Michelangelo, but it has an entirely different feel than Caravaggio's work because of the drama of the chiaroscuro, the isolation of the figures in the foreground. Another version, Caravaggio did several during this period when he was in Naples, had a bit of time on his hands, and his patrons really liked what he did with these kinds of scenes. It gave him a chance to show Jesus' body, a beautiful male body. It doesn't really show us how the body really looked because it was full of welts and it had the marks of scourging, and bits of bone would have broken off into the body. But Caravaggio's goal was otherwise. It was to render the human form. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. This is unusually sober for Bosch. It's not priming the ugliness so much, although you have a man who looks just like a goat down here, and another man in a dog collar. So he's trying to convey the idea of bestiality amongst these people. This man, because he has the crescent moon and star, represents the merchant class that traded with Turkey and was thought, therefore, to be traitorous. This gentleman represents the military power. This gentleman represents, it is thought, the papacy. And this gentleman represents either the people themselves or the academic class. This is a kind of a familiar device that artists used at that time to show the different members of society surrounding Jesus. But the point of the picture is Jesus looking right out at us. His gaze is unmistakable. Everybody in the picture is looking at him, but Bosch has made him look at you. And it's put you, me, in the position of the accuser. So we are implicated in this crowning of thorns. A very different version of it, the crown of thorns being thrust onto Jesus' head. a very manneristic painting by Titian with all kinds of tortured movements and unusual positions of the bodies, a lot of heavy musculature, almost too muscled, and unusual fluttering of garments. But equally powerful, we have Tiberius Caesar looking down as Roman justice is being exerted. Caravaggio again, with a very bored guard here, leaning on a support, just doing his job as he lets the torturers plunge the crown of thorns into Jesus' head. Again, the beautiful use of oil to convey the armor, sophisticated feathers. There's such a difference between the bored guard and the brutality that's happening over here. And you'll notice the diagonals that cascade through the picture. So it kind of takes your eye in a spiral, which I think is very intentional on the part of Caravaggio. Grunewald, almost like Bosch, caricatural ugliness, brutishness as Christ is blindfolded and beaten. He's absolutely defenseless as the blows rain down on his head. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." Mantegna, this is in a very beautiful little museum in Paris called the Musée Jacquemart-André, and if you ever get the chance, do visit it. It has some real gems, and this is one of them. Mantegna's almost stony conception, as he so often makes a sculptural view of things. You can barely make out, but there's a profile back here, another face here. Jesus is surrounded. This gentleman has what are mock kind of Hebrew scriptures. This is Latin above saying, "Crucify him, tolle eum," which means take him away, be off with him. And Jesus, again, looks out at us for our decision, what we will do with him. Metsis or Massis, there's a dispute about his name. Again, a very defenseless Jesus. You can see how his crown of thorns is doubled by the capital of that pillar in back of him, with a Pilate not willing to look at him. And we'll see in a close-up, this man can't even focus his two eyes. This is a wandering eye. This man is dazed and glazed off in the distance. And this man has an insane gaze. He's the one looking at Jesus, but you can tell it's with a kind of madness, a dementia in his visage, with his eyes terribly narrowed. Again, it's almost ironic. He wears this golden chain, whereas Christ has been chained, and the beautiful metal rings, not willing to look, and this man not even being able to focus his eyes to see what's going on. Gazing into the distance, and then just fury on his face. A totally different take here with Titian, which is very unusual for him. This kind of almost chiaroscuro, no background whatsoever. This is such a depiction of the man of sorrows. Dejection, sadness, grief, abandonment. He couldn't be more lonely. And he bears the marks of his scourging. Caravaggio, again, some people have disputed this because they really didn't want Caravaggio to have done something like this, a very young whippersnapper kind of a Jesus who looks like a young stripling and has no scar or mark on his body as he receives the kingly robe and the scepter. And the judge, dressed in very contemporary fashion, gestures toward him, "Behold the man." Pilate's gesture. Rembrandt, early in his career, a remarkable print. It's an Ecce Homo and at the same time Pilate washing his hands in a sense of it. This is Rembrandt himself, and he often does this in the scenes of the Passion that he painted. He puts himself in it so that he experiences, and he's telling you, this is what I saw as I imagined Jesus' moment. But he also makes himself one of the people who beats and scourges Jesus. So he doesn't feel he is innocent in this. Couldn't be more different. He totally changes his print technique. He takes away all the details and features an anonymous crowd, which we didn't have before. We had many more details of faces before. And we have the scene of blind justice and fortitude. And these were on the Palace of Justice in Amsterdam at that time. So it's a kind of an echo of the municipality where he lived. This is Pilate's wife, who warned him, have nothing to do with that man. She foresaw in a dream that something bad would come of this. Rembrandt makes second use of the same copper plate, which is very expensive and wears down very quickly, but he puts it to use again by taking away all the people in the foreground, and we then become the audience, the people crying out that Jesus be crucified. Pilate's wife is up here in the window. And almost like two eyes looking out at us. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Bosch again, and there's nobody who knows how to get the lunatics out of the asylum as well as Bosch does. And if we thought that piercing was a thing of our times, take a look. Take a look at the piercings on these people. It was thought of as being a demonic kind of thing to do. And so nowadays we have a lot of people running around with a lot of pretty ugly piercings. This is Veronica. There's the almost mythological story, it's not in the Bible, of Saint Veronica, who presses a cloth up to Jesus' face as he is carrying his cross, and the legend is that his image was imprinted on it. And you'll note that it's only in that image that we see Jesus looking out at us, because here his eyes are closed. This is the evil thief, and this is the good thief as they are being led off to face their own ends. And Jesus is in the middle of that swirling mess, as he is here with Lotto. And Lotto puts us on the spot, as so many do, in their creation of Jesus carrying his cross. And I'll give you a brief video that I think is kind of instructive.
Forbes, the head of museum interpretation at the High Museum of Art. The painting behind me is my personal favorite in this entire exhibition. I just fell in love with it the first time I saw it in the gallery just behind the Mona Lisa at the Louvre. It's a story of changing tastes. This painting was made during the Renaissance in about 1526 by an artist no one's ever heard of, Lorenzo. And he made it for a convent to decorate, their convent, a very powerful and emotional picture of Christ carrying the cross. Over time, the convent changed. People who were at the convent probably decided to change what was decorating the convent, and this ended up in the attic, and for years it just stayed in the attic of the convent. Finally, in the 1980s, it made its way to the hands of an antique dealer in France, and they brought it to the Louvre, and eventually, after a good cleaning, they were able to discover the artist's signature written upside down and on an angle on the cross, so that if the cross were turned right side up, the signature would be able to be read clearly. It's a fascinating place to put the signature. And they were able to identify this as an artist who worked at the time of Leonardo da Vinci, and an artist who was a rediscovery. But tastes had changed, and so it was sort of lost to time. And
Titian doing very much the same thing as Lotto did, with a very heart-rending scene of Christ looking out at us as he bears his cross and the tears come down. This is one of Bruegel's most famous works. It's one of his largest. It's about 5 by 4. And you wouldn't even be able to distinguish the cross if you didn't look right into the center of the painting where Jesus is bearing the cross and falling away under it. Over here, Simon of Cyrene is being pressed into service by Roman guards. His wife is trying to hold him back, and the guards are pulling him away. The scene that's usually featured at the foot of the cross of Mary and the women and John lamenting Jesus is pushed to the foreground here as if to take them away out of the madness. These are the two thieves being carried to their fate, and they're actually anachronistically holding crosses and confessing to confessors here on the way. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. The people are going to this execution as if to a fair, and indeed, at that time, executions were public festivals. So people bring their lunches and their children and go watch people crucified. This is the artist who gazes on. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, and they crucified him. So Giotto, with the angels catching Jesus' blood, lamenting in these wonderfully expressive ways, the Magdalene at the foot of the cross, St. Francis anachronistically incorporated into this. Rembrandt, again, featuring himself at the foot of the cross, part and parcel of the nailing in of the nails as the cross is put into place. This I'm also going to give you a video about, and I hope you'll be able to sit through it. It's about 7 minutes, but it's worth it. About the perspective, Masaccio was the first to perfect this. It's the earliest appearance of it. Jesus, God the Father. This is written at the bottom over the tomb. I once was what you are, and what I am, you also will be.
The first painter to fully utilize Brunelleschi's theories of perspective and apply them with astonishing effect was Masaccio. On a wall in a church in Florence, Masaccio created a three-dimensional illusion unlike any the world had ever seen. This extraordinary work, called the Trinity, finished about 1427, was the first known painting to demonstrate true linear perspective. For the people of Masaccio's day, it was as if the artist had dissolved the wall and created a new room. Yet, it was still a painting, just an illusion. Utilizing the power of the computer and digital technology, we can explore this imaginary space. Masaccio used perspective to create a space so consistent that we can actually enter the room. The computer even lets us rotate the room to look at the coffered inside of the vault from directly below. The images of Christ and the other figures become flat without sufficient visual information to create fully three-dimensional forms. Assuming that the coffers are square, the room itself becomes a rectangle, as we can see when we look at it from above. We can also view the room from the side. The black patches represent the parts of the ceiling that are covered by the architectural capitals that Masaccio painted in the foreground. The powerful effect of this illusion, painted by a young artist only in his 20s, is astonishing. Scaffolding erected for restoration of the Trinity provides us with the opportunity to examine the fresco at close range. The cleaning of the painting now completed, conservators fill in missing areas of the fresco with water-soluble paint, which can be removed at any time. Masaccio's original work is never touched. Strong raking lights help to highlight the surface of the plaster, enabling us to explore details not visible from the floor of the church below, and revealing Masaccio's technique. His use of perspective and geometry is extraordinary. All elements of the architecture grow out of his perspective design. Masaccio constructed the curves of the vaulted ceiling by stretching a length of string from a nail set in the wall and using a stylus to score the arcs into the wet plaster. He also incised lines to determine the perspective scheme for the work. This line, still visible, leads from the vanishing point below. To create straight lines such as these, Masaccio sent a tautly stretched string into the wet plaster. You can still see the twisted texture of the string, preserved in the plaster for nearly 600 years. Masaccio made holes to mark the triangular corners of the pyramids, painted on the inner surface of the arch. He also used a geometrical instrument to construct the rondos near the top of the composition. Incised lines define their outer rims and the edges of the fluting contained within. Masaccio created a network of large squares as a guide to painting the body of the Virgin. A grid of smaller squares was used for the drawing of her head, a challenge in foreshortening. They can still be seen. Each day he worked on the Trinity, Masaccio would cover a small portion of the wall with wet plaster, only as much as he could finish painting before the plaster dried.
I don't think we need to go on with the rest because it just explains the order in which it was painted each day. And I want to continue just to finish what we're viewing today with Grunewald's terrifying crucifixion, but it's probably one of the more accurate versions of what Jesus' body suffered in the scourging. It was done for a hospital in what at that time was Germany. It's now France. You can see it in Colmar. And people in the hospital there suffered from a disease called ergotism, which came from rye that had been fermented and bacteria had gotten into it. It gave them hallucinations, and they suffered skin blotches and sores, just like Jesus suffers on the cross here. He doesn't spare the details. A very, very powerful altarpiece that we'll come back to, actually, for the resurrection. Zurbaran's 9.5 foot by 5 foot crucifixion is powerful, it's chiaroscuro, very dramatic. But for me, I think his more poignant image of the Lamb of God is this one, which is maybe 1/16 its size. But the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world could not be more defenseless here, more beautiful, with his feet bound. It was in an exhibition called Seeing Salvation, and people just crowded around it. It's so meticulously, beautifully done. One of Rembrandt's most famous 3 crosses print And he changes it radically. He's trying to use almost cinematic light to show the moment when the earth opened up. There were earthquakes, thunderclaps, heavens opened. And it's hard to do that in a print, but he manages. He even takes it to an extreme. He makes the evil thief just tumble into the darkness. Darkness falls, and Jesus is alone there. It's just amazing by scoring the copper sheet how he does this. You may be familiar with Dali's Crucifixion, which I don't feel actually shows the heart of the matter, but this is Galilee down below. It's a God's eye view, and he drew his inspiration from St. John of the Cross. This is a small manuscript from centuries before Dali, and it's how God saw his son. This St. John of the Cross, a Spanish mystic, envisioned this. So there you have it. Next week will be our last session, and it'll be in meeting rooms 1 and 2 next to the Pittenger Center. And I want to thank you now for your faithful attendance. I want to thank St. Mary's for giving us this beautiful space week after week to do this. Several people have asked how they could thank us for that. And of course, your membership would be wonderful if you want to join the St. Mary's family, but a donation would certainly not be refused. Not to me, but to St. Mary's. That is not a request. It's just because some people have asked. But I thank you, and I look for you next week.